First off, disclaimer. Keep in mind, the measurements that I provide are taken off my computer screen, and the data is true for me, a short woman from a distance of 6 meters, throwing the handle-heavy arrows using a no-spin shuriken type throw. This throw differs from my normal no-spin throw, which has more of a bullet spin and no backspin. So this data may not be exact, and could be different according to how you throw, what you throw, and your size. But it should give you a general idea of how the knife flies through the air. So let's get started. Let's take apart a good throw. I'm gonna call this the perfect spin because it has the perfect amount of spin from 6 meters. Here, the peak of the knife's trajectory occurs when the knife hits that 90-degree angle. From there, the knife does a nosedive at the target. For the perfect spin at 6 meters, that 90-degree angle peak has to occur around the 4.5 meter mark, or in other words, 1.5 meters in front of me. My next question was, just how much backspin do you need to get that knife to peak at that 1.5 meter mark? The answer? Between 150 to 155 degrees. Of course, there are some exceptions to this. Here, I got to stick with 180-degree backspin. The other day, I was able to get a stick with a 130-degree backspin. But for the majority of my sticks, most of them occurred when I was able to get my release angle between 150 to 155 degrees. Here's an average perfect spin throw. Here's my best throw because it has a sharp, loud thunk, which I believe means that it has more force. If you compare the two releases, the release in the best throw happens a fraction of a second later. I believe this is because I maximized that push-brush release, meaning I was able to brush that knife all the way to the end of the handle. This results in a greater backspin of 165 degrees, which allows the knife to push forward more and peak from 3 meters away. Since the peak of this best spin occurs closer to the target, it has more force, thus results in a louder thunk. The next question is, how much backspin results in an overspin, meaning the knife hits handle up? Almost every overspin had too little backspin, in which the release angle was 140 degrees. This resulted in the 90-degree peak occurring between 1/4 meter to 3/4 meter away from me. Since this peak occurs too early in the knife's trajectory, there's just too much of a distance for that nosedive. Let's look closely at the release of both throws. Side by side, you can see that both throws look identical, but the release of the overspin occurs slightly earlier than the perfect spin. What I take from this is that in the perfect spin, I completed the push-slide release, which allowed me to get enough backspin. Whereas in the overspin, the release is incomplete, which leads to too little backspin. Overall, completing the push-slide release results in the perfect amount of backspin. This allows the knife to reach that sweet spot of 1.5 meters, giving it enough time to nosedive and hit the target. What if the knife peaks way far ahead of you? This results in an underspin, meaning the knife hits the target blade up. The release angles for the underspins varied all over the place, from 142 degrees to 150, all the way up to 160 degrees. What all these underspins had in common was that 90-degree peak occurred much farther than that 1.5 meter mark. Because this peak occurs too close to the target, the knife doesn't have enough time to turn and start its nosedive. The difference between these two releases is that the underspin release happens after the perfect spin release. Even though the release angle is the same, it simply looks like the underspin release doesn't get as much oomph as the perfect spin. Perhaps if the target was farther away and lower to the ground, the underspin would have stuck. But it just doesn't turn as sharply like in the perfect spin throw, where you can clearly see a peak and a nosedive. Instead, the underspin throw looks more like a slow spin, which I think is the result of too slow of a release rather than a whipping brush forward. Lastly, I had to look at that elusive reverse spin, which I didn't even know existed until I slowed down the footage. There were 3 types of reverse spins I found. Ones that failed completely, others that looked like they would have stuck only if I had a lower target, and finally, the sticks. A couple of the fails peaked at over 4 meters away. This peak is way too close to the target, so it doesn't stick. I believe the mistake here is much like the mistake in the underspin release, in that the push-slide release occurs too slowly, so the release happens later, which results in too slow of a reverse spin. Too much backspin isn't always a good thing. The backspin here is 190 degrees. What happens is that the peak occurs 3/4 of a meter away, which is way too far from the target. Now when my backspins were 180 degrees, it resulted in a reverse spin that would hit low. If I had a lower target, these would have most likely stuck. So what stuck? Almost every time it was a 160-degree backspin that would peak at 3 meters. It looks like the only difference here is that getting that correct release angle allows it to peak at the right moment to hit the target. For a chest-high target, you need about 160 degrees of backspin so it can peak at 3 meters. If you increase that backspin to 180 degrees, the knife peaks closer at 2.75 meters and does an early nosedive to hit that low target. So what are your takeaways from this? Usually, too little of a backspin results in an overspin because the knife's peak occurs too far from the target. Just the right amount of backspin allows for the knife to peak at the correct distance to complete its nosedive. If the push-slide release is too slow, then the knife does a very slow spin. Therefore, the peak occurs way too close to the target, resulting in an underspin. The same applies for the push-slide release of a reverse spin. If the release is too slow, the peak also occurs too close to the target, resulting in a failed throw. If you have a lot of backspin, the throw might be a successful reverse spin. For me, as long as the peak occurred at 3 meters, the knife had enough time to complete the nosedive. Too much backspin may result in a failed reverse spin. However, this depends on the height of your target. These are not hard and fast rules. As I said, there are exceptions. Too little backspin doesn't always result in an overspin. Too much backspin doesn't always result in a failed reverse spin. And even adding just a little bit more backspin gave me a hard-hitting stick rather than a reverse spin. So what does this mean for you when you're trying to get more distance? The majority of my fails occur due to overspinning the knife. The best way to correct this is to focus on completing that push-slide release, meaning the index finger should slide down to the very ends of the knife's handle. There should also be an emphasis on pushing the knife farther ahead so it reaches its peak at the appropriate distance. In addition, the release should snap forward rather than occurring too slowly. Thanks for watching! I'm really excited for my next video, so be sure to stay tuned to my channel. See you guys later! Bye!